Manly Hall Official is glad to produce, publish and offer. Dedicated to our old students. Occultism will never grow monotonous or lack the divinely human touch while we have among us those glorious ones who emit their radiant auras of self-achievement as they promenade the byways of our occult groves. Wherever we turn we find those ever-present ones, who, like rays of sunshine in our troubled lives, breeze in to tell us of their accomplishments. Let me draw a picture for you. Indeed it is a masterpiece. Poor, weary Mr. Doe, long searching mid the archives of the past, dropping pebble after pebble into the depthless oracles of Greece, hoping against hope that some echo will waft back to him, sits surrounded by his thoughts, Hebrew lexicons, and Greek almanacs, seeking to find that which will bring him omnipotence. As he wanders midst those depthless pages which show upon their creased surfaces footprints where bookworms have trod, a voice rises and reverberates upon his dun-colored landscape. Beside him appears a strange creature, mayhap a denizen of some distant plain, Hoboken, N.J., whose description we will try to assist you to build in that floating substance between the ears. His name is Solomon J. Weisenheimer, and he holds the international occult talking record, having kept his jaws moving continuously for 92 hours without saying anything. Mr. Weisenheimer is a small man about 5'1", but what he lacks in size he makes up in conspiration, for wherever you may look from the Grand Canyon of Arizona to the Natural Bridge of Virginia, he is always the largest and most prominent object in sight. It is true that he cannot talk very clearly, having asthma and ingrowing diabetes. His glasses are about 1.5 inches thick, for he is nearly blind. His upper plate falls every few moments. He dyes his eyebrows to match his toupee, and his wooden leg always squeaks when he walks. But he is not so bad looking, for he keeps his mange under good control. As he stands beside the struggling Mr. Doe, he is a perfect picture of the vintage of the year one. "I see you are a student of the occult," says Mr. Weisenheimer. "So am I. I am one of the original class of Monsieur Whoop. You will remember him, of course. He is the famous Slavonian Kabbalist. I studied with him for years and years, and have written several books myself on physical regeneration and kindred subjects. I am the ex-Grand Master of the mystic Wallapuk Shrine, and if I do say it myself, I don't think there's another person on earth who has come so close to the realization of the mystic. I see things. As I gaze upon you, there is a peculiar greenish-gray aura surrounding you. Oh yes, sir, I am a seer. I go into trances. It is very wonderful when you get as far advanced as I am." The peculiar greenish haze which was surrounding Mr. Doe was the result of that individual having become petrified with horror for fear that his studies would produce the same effect upon him as it had on Mr. Weisenheimer. If you're enjoying this video and finding value in the content, we kindly ask you to take a moment to subscribe to the channel. A large portion of our listeners and viewers haven't subscribed yet, and by doing so, you'll help us grow and continue bringing you more high-quality audiobooks. Your support means a lot to us, and it's just one click away. So, go ahead and hit that subscribe button to stay connected and never miss out on our latest releases. The thought flashed through his mind that if that is what occultism did for one man, he would leave it at once and join the First Orthodox Fiji Island Church. Swallowing his innate feelings, Mr. Doe made a graceful departing speech and hurriedly left the scenes of his late labors, leaving Mr. W to visualize complacently the effect that his overwhelming soul growth had had upon Mr. Doe. "My powers simply hypnotized them," murmured Mr. Weisenheimer as he also vanished from the frame of our picture, leaving a refreshing vacuum behind him. Of course, some of our readers may feel that we have not treated this subject with justice and that we ought to have said a great deal more, but we must ask them to imagine the rest upon the strength of what they have gone through themselves while cloistered with one of these near philosophers. They have their place, however, for utterly unknown to themselves the old students are the occult comedians and mirth provokers, and are the basis for the laughter of the gods. Students come up to us regularly to qualify themselves in art, philosophy, music, and paternal judgment with the aid of rheumatism and white side whiskers, feeling that a snowy crest or an appearance resembling a spring freshet should deserve consideration, respect, and veneration. A certain class of mystics just love to tell us how many cycles they have studied in this or how many decades they have immersed themselves in that, having a peculiarly distorted idea that their superiority is based upon the length of time they have expended in a certain work, failing to realize that ages of effort unwisely expended will produce nothing, and that the length of time passed in study has little to do with the position of the soul in the great path, for some have done more in a few hours than some of our oldest students will do in a lifetime. I must explain to you a few types of said occult mirth provokers whom we could not help but smile at if we did not realize what a tragic place they hold and what a tremendous sorrow that must come to them when they wake and realize how little they really know. The divine egotist is always with us, and the trouble is the egotist seldom if ever is himself aware of his traits, but blaming everyone but himself for his troubles, and claiming that others are simple because they do not agree with him. He goes on through life never convinced of the foolishness of his own concepts. It is a tragedy in any line of life, but in spiritual things it is doubly so. But for the good of those whom it may offend, we must show you a few types commonly met with who are their own worst enemies and who in reality are never as far advanced as the average person that they talk to. For it is the depth of the soul, the true spiritual understanding and practical works that are the basis of occult mastership, and the real old student is the last of all who could claim that position. It is a hard thing to say, yet it is true and must be said for the protection of others. A large number of people who claim spiritual vision and first-hand knowledge have not got it and never did have. 50% of our so-called clairvoyants would be scared to death if they even saw an elemental and would run 20 miles from the first superphysical thing that confronted them. But as old students who should be conscious on all these planes, etc., and as nobody else is liable to be able to check them up, they tack on a few of these things for good measure to the awe of the foolish and the disgust of the initiate. First, I want you to meet Exhibit A, Mrs. Ophelia Wobbletripe, who has tormented the community of truth seekers for about 50 years. She is a dashing dowager who has talked some of our greatest minds into a state of coma, then left them perfectly satisfied that she had confounded the elders. Madam has studied with every known Swami, yogi, saint, patriarch and master since the Civil War, and has autographed photographs of the leading religion dispensers of the modern world. They would have given her anything they had to get rid of her. Mrs. Ophelia is a very much present student who can always be found in the front row with her mouth wide open, possibly to show her gold bridgework, going into shivering ecstasies of admiration for some exponent of things divine whom she nearly drives to distraction with an ostrich feather fan or some crinkling note papers. Mrs. Wobbletripe can quote Sanskrit by the yard, can decline Hebrew verbs, has climbed Mt. Shasta, and is the proud owner of a Syriac Bible, which she uses for a paperweight. During the first 15 minutes of her acquaintance, you discover that she has been around the world 14 times, has had several major operations, and has relations married to the most eminent people in the country, with a continuous list of husbands who pass silently to their only rest in the cemetery over the hill. She has a cousin-in-law who owns one of the largest salt licks in Arizona, has been prepared at court without tripping on her train, and has a brother who is an eminent bootlegger. Mrs. Wobbletripe comes from a very excellent family and has a grandniece whose uncle's sister is the wife of Lord Saturday, Knight of the Bath. One of her husbands, now deceased, and who is at rest save when she joins him on the astral plane, made millions in Chinese Ks which he imported for sugar refineries, and her eldest son by her 9th husband is married to the daughter of Samoa's bone fertilizer king. All this we get in the first 15 minutes conversation, as I said before. She is subject to hectic delirium, which she believes is a visionary condition, and peculiar feelings come over her occasionally which she attributes to communication with the masters, but is probably due to the little bubbles of uric acid poisoning which she extracts from her beefsteaks. Madame is a wonderful example of the so-called old students, for it is safe to say that she knows absolutely nothing about anything except her own ideas, which are the center and radius of her life. There's no use talking to the lady because she is completely satisfied with her own gamut of unconsciousness and knows more than any other person alive and admits it. If you are in trouble spiritually, she will have some excellent advice for you which she has never attempted to use herself, but quotes it verbatim from her favorite Swami. She has inflammatory rheumatism, kidney trouble, is very much overweight, won't walk, and spends half her time at Madame Gump's, who is trying to eliminate 7 or 8 of her extra chins painlessly. Kind reader and fellow sufferer, you may not believe that such creatures exist, but they do and can be found anywhere that students of things supernal gather. She will always be found very much in evidence and expresses herself with great confidence upon every conceivable problem. This is an old student. Taking the Funk and Wagnall definition of old, we find that it says in part, things liable to decay or having lived and existed in a certain state for a long time. This particular type has lived in a state of coma for ages and will only come out of it when nature prays her loose. Many students have reached that enviable stage of crystallization when, having found something that to them is perfect, they sit back in complacent mental ossification and bask in the aura of their own accomplishments. We will pass on the Type B, Section X, who is the occult antiquarian and has that wisdom which no one else can get hold of. He is the chosen of the Master's type. Professor Nebuchadrezzar Nibs has studied where no one else can go, but with lofty superiority he condescends to allow others to drink occasionally at the fountain of his divine wisdom. Nebsy is shrouded in credentials of a mystic nature, including a veterinary diploma, and being a member of several secret orders practices the pass signs every morning so as not to forget them. Neighbors watching him in the morning think he is taking calisthenics, but he is only making the secret sign of the 9th degree of the Sacred Order of Imperial Bunkum. He has been a private pupil of the famous Sylvester Sandstorm, one of Matilda Brainfag's inside group, has studied at the feet of Algernon Spoutley and all the other leading occult luminaries. He will tell you confidentially what they told him confidentially, misquoting leading authorities with the ease and fluency of a practiced liar. He is always surrounded by a number of gushtive individuals carrying light cargoes of mentoids who found in him the resurrection of a martyr or the reincarnation of a saint and savior within the first 30 days. Professor Nibbs admits that he is an old student also, and he always admits it before anyone else questions him. Everything he does is in a secret and concealed manner. He even thinks in such a carefully hidden way that no other creature could possibly imagine that was what he was doing. Nebsy admits that he is acquainted with all the leading occultists of the world and recognizes the soul growth in Exhibit A. He has had a very checkered career since he stopped working in the saloon, which career he has perpetuated in a checkered suit. He is willing to share his superior knowledge with humanity for a reasonable consideration, said compensation being as much cash as the other fellow has got. Nebuchadrezzar Nibbs talks with the dead every night. He is out of his body half the time and out of his head the other. We sometimes believe that he got lost on the astral plane and forgot to come back. He is surrounded by ethereal creatures and material dupes, and a bald head, a wise look, and 75 years of stone rolling constitute his stock in trade. He knows absolutely nothing about anything but conceals this under paternal eyebrows and a saged appearance, which means absolutely nil, and when asked, the quizzer always replies that that information is only given out in the higher grades. Having completed our analysis of Type B, we pass on to Type CX, the astrological contortionist and numerological sprainer, Miss Delilia Wampus. No occult group is complete without her, and she is with us even unto the end of the world. Her specialty is birth paths and evil aspects. She is perpetually suffering from acute angles and afflictions in her rising sign, and can always be found seeking the hour and minute of some individual's birth and then informing them that by compound ratio or mathematical hydraulics that the z²x means that their husband will run off with the chauffeur's wife or that their hours are numbered. Miss Wampus is a specialist at prognostication. She has prophesied every winter that has happened during her lifetime. She knows exactly when the world will end and is waiting patiently for a certain aspect to culminate, for when it does she is going to do great things. Miss W. Impus is an old maid. She declined 3 aspirants to her hand because their rising sign was not congenial with her own. Her best aspect is Saturn trine Jupiter, and she never misses an opportunity to express these good qualities and to explain that they are the base of her divine understanding. Miss Wampus also sees things occasionally and is no concentrating for prosperity, feeling quite confident that the transit of the moon will assist. She runs her life by astrology, numerology, and kindred sciences and plans out her daily work according to astrological hours. She eats astrology and then, like our family cow, chews it some more. She inhales and exhales sidereal time and has her tea on the table of houses, and whenever she closes her eyes she sees black horoscope forms. She has been pronounced demented by her relatives because she goes up to perfect strangers on the street and asks them if they have 9 degrees of Taurus in the 8th house. Leaving this specimen in its glass case, we pass on to Exhibit D, one of the most interesting and remarkable examples of old student formation that we have. This particular species is known as the mouthpiece of the gods. After having passed through 35 or 40 years of indolent probation's hip, he is now a self-ordained mouthpiece used by the masters of wisdom to sell vacuum cleaners, electric irons, magazine subscriptions, and to dispense the occult wisdom generally. Yes, among our old students we find a large number who are being used by the masters and are in constant communication with the lords of high degree. You will always know them as they sit around discussing the haircut of their favorite patriarch. When we analyze this series of specimens, we feel certain that the only thing which the elders could use them for would be scarecrows and danger signals, and there is no doubt that many of our so-called old students in reality are warnings that if we act likewise we may be as had as they are. Between Indian guides, masters and departed swamis, we are raising a wonderful group of old students whose particular form of insanity leads them to believe that the Lord has singled them out as exceptionally useful instruments when they have dispositions like the old Nick himself and bodies below the animal standard. I have seen these mouthpieces of the gods tearing hair over the hack fence and declaring themselves in ardent language tinged with blue and scarlet sparks of choice profanity. Then, half an hour later, they lead a silence meeting and wish damnation upon their opponents. These old students tell you confidentially that they spent the night hobnobbing with the Lord, or that the master so-and-so told them you were to loan them $2.50, or that God told them that the house and lot they want will flutter down from the ethers to them. We prefer to believe that the old student is demented than that the lords of reason are capable of such absurdities. They are our demonstrative old students, and their intelligence is just below that a mineral. Altogether, this quartet of spiritual malformations constitutes quite a percentage of our so-called orthodox atheists. They call themselves old students. No one else will call them at all for fear that they may show up. They have been put out of their homes as nuisances. Most of them have ruined the next 2 or 3 generations through their idiosyncrasies and mental acidities, and now they spend their time snoozing through religion. Instead of having ripened with age, they have green spots coming out on them and are fast falling victims to the spirit of corrosion. These are our old, advanced students. They admit it, they gloat in it, glorify in it, and wallow around in it, never realizing that they are the most perfect specimens of unconscious egotists that disgrace the garlands of our sciences. Will people ever get through with the idea that they know something? Self-satisfaction is the basis of decay, and there are none who know as little as those who think they know a great deal. Socrates said that he was the wisest man in Athens because he was the only man who knew he was a fool. Many an old student has told how much he knew and shown how much he didn't know to one he didn't have sense enough to realize was his superior. The first thing an old student really learns to do is to keep his mouth shut and plod along. Are there any old students? Technically, no. But in this world of affairs, those who have gained the most of practical knowledge have superiority over those who have done nothing. The true old student is known by his deeper understanding of life and its problems, and not by incessant palate calisthenics. The jawbone of Samson's donkey is still slaying as it did of old, and many a suffering mortal has gone with gray hairs to a sorrowful grave, talked to death by one of them, said bone being vitalized by an old student's motive power. Not 1 in 100 of our so-called old students show any symptoms of spiritual age, but the creaks that we hear when they chew indicates that the organism is dying out and that they are slowly passing into the great beyond as ignorant of their destiny as before, with nothing to say to their Lord except a quotation from Pythagoras or a couple of Patanjali's aphorisms. It is a very sad thing how little we strive to build for permanence and truth, and how seldom we find one who is really willing to consecrate his soul to the truth and in silence and simplicity carry on his master's work, whispering his age and the wisdom of his thoughts, the depth of his understanding and the sweetness of his compassion. The chick and the shell. Most people are acquainted with the fact that chickens come out of eggs. This being an accepted theory, proven by repeated phenomena, no further consideration is given to the problem, and we watch the wonderful processes of nature with a divine unconcern, seeing many things, but thinking little about them. Now there is no greater lesson in all the world than the baby chick and the eggshell. How wonderfully nature protects the coming in of its little creatures, how it builds around the unprotected form walls and barriers that the latent lives may gradually awaken without danger of untimely interruption. Here the embryo chick in its shell carries on, under the direction of the group spirit, the wonderful work of building a complex organism of blood, bone, and feather, unseen to the eyes of mortal creature. But now the great lesson. The tiny chick at last completes its embryonic growth, and its parent shell, the divine father and protector of its tiny life, now becomes its worst enemy. If it is unable to break through that wall, it will surely die destroyed by its own protection. Is this not a lesson in the study of man, his growth, and his development? Are not the walls and laws and the spiritual guidance which protect man in his early infancy the ruts and channels that he later gets into? Are not the concepts which are bred in him as necessary parts of his youth and later life of 10 walls and shells which will destroy him? Are not the creeds and religions which have guarded the infancy of his unfoldment like the shells of the egg which protect him to a certain point and then strangle him? Are these not Kronos, the father of the god Saturn, who devoured his own children? Great light should come to the soul of man when he studies a problem of this kind. Let us take it in another phase. Does not crystallization build around man the bodies necessary for his manifestation here? And does not crystallization also, after it reaches a certain point, inhibit the very qualities which it makes possible? Do not our thoughts build us and yet bind us by walls of our own limitations? It surely seems that they do. Our past concepts have built us and made possible our reaching human intelligence, and yet, sad to say, there comes a time when our very ideals strangle us unless all of our life grows great together, unless the shell expands with the egg which no crystallized substance can. It must break or else destroy the life growing within it. Those who would go on to greater and more glorious fields of expression must break the shell of crystallization which holds them in, ties them down, and places around them the strangle cord of limitation. Yet in breaking this shell we must do it with reverence, for has it not been for many years our protection, our shield and our buckler? Our love for it, however, and our respect for the labors and growth we have passed through beneath its protection must not deter us from breaking it, for its greatest joy is in the realization that its work is done. It may rend our hearts to break the shell, but we will die if we do not, and neither we nor the shell will benefit thereby. All people who have set ideas are surrounded by shell. Sometimes these shells are large enough to allow growth to go on within them, but there are other times when the spirit is cramped within its shell. We must be willing and glad to break away from the concepts that limit us. This is one of the hardest things in the world to do, for we all love the thing we have been associated with, the things which we learned when young, the creeds, the philosophies, the ideals which helped us to grow in the years that are past. They are in truth the fathers of the things we are, and yet in order to grow it is necessary for us to slay the parent. This point is beautifully brought out in the legend of Krishna and the battle of Kurukshetra, where the youthful prince, in compliance with the laws of Krishna, drew the arrow to the head and slew with it his own sire. Too often our spiritual channels of expression become too narrow for us, but we need never be narrow ourselves, for when a creed begins to bind us, then the moment has arrived when with the spear of truth and light we must slay our own protector, lest he slay us with his walls of living stones. So the little chick breaks the shell and comes forth, or failing to break the shell dies within it, and once more the father protector has slain his child with his loving embrace, because the child was not strong enough to slay the parent. Like the seed in the ground, which is nourished and guarded by the green mold and yet ofttimes is murdered thereby, so the spirit of man is protected by the shell of matter, which ofttimes slays its own son when the child does not rise triumphant from the protecting womb. The Occult Acid Test. As precious metals are tested with acids, so the spiritual doctrines and ideals of the student must be submitted to test. None should be accepted nor rejected upon advice, like or dislike, but upon the pure unemotional principles of worth should they be judged. The sacred wisdom of the ancients is now being given openly to the world, but at the same time there are many false doctrines creeping in that promise much but produce nothing. The days of secretiveness and the superiority of a few are drawing to a close, and all of the true occult works are being given to the world, freed from the mystery of the Middle Ages. Below we list a number of questions. When investigating the merits of a doctrine, use these as the acid test. Regardless of whether you like or dislike the doctrine, stand by the decision that your conscience makes when it compares the creed with the ideal. If it be a true outpouring of the schools of knowledge, it will be a doctrine of effort and individual responsibility, striving to build and unfold each soul to perfect independence. A doctrine free from the taint of commercialism, exorbitant prices, and inner circles where only the financially elect can go. Productive of individual thought and seeking to unfold the reason of the student, making him independent of his instructors rather than a slave to them. A doctrine of evolution rather than creation, of eternal progression rather than a doctrine with an end. A doctrine of cause and effect, labor for the thing desired, and not one of miracles and superhuman powers. Free from the whiplash of plagues and terrors, not drawing you into it through fear of damnation. Based upon principles rather than personalities, worshiping truth and not the one who brings it. Slow but sure, promising nothing but opening the doors to all. Free from peace, power, and plenty scheming and get-rich-quick plans of all kinds. A doctrine of equality with equal opportunities for all and special privileges for none. Fearless in its declaration of principles and conscientious in its effort to live up to them. Free from perverted sex philosophies, soulmating, and so forth, always obeying the law of the land wherein it is. Staunch in its defense of the physical body, pleading for its development and growth that it may become the living temple. Based upon the doctrines of compassion, renunciation, service, and self-sacrifice, neither gloomy nor melancholy but peaceful and true. Free from much wordiness and mushiness, teaching all its truths in a simple way. True to the principle that the destiny of a people rests in its own hands and that no vicarious atonement can save it. Based upon the 7 liberal arts and sciences and teaching that knowledge is the eternal victor over ignorance. Considerate of all other creeds and doctrines, realizing and living the great truth that all religions are one. Based upon the solid rock of brotherhood and cooperation and standing for the fellowship of spirit and of body. Free from claims and pretenses and untouched by the spirit of egotism. The last to ever say that it is great, seeking only to serve, and expecting no reward. Strong in its demand for practical religion taught through right living, right thinking, right aspiring and right purification. If the philosophy which you are interested in teaches these things in a rational way, follow it, study it and learn of it, but if it fails to live up to these thoughts, shun it as you would a leprous thing, for it will bring with it only sorrow, suffering and an untimely end. This is the acid test. The Master speaks. As I spoke, it seemed that I was no longer a mortal man, and that instead of a human brain my source of information was the mind of God Himself. The presence of the Master behind me gave great courage and consolation, so, daring all things while I knew that He was near, I told of the mysteries of life and of death. As I looked around the room, it seemed filled with white-robed forms, and great streams of life and light poured into me, then seemed to radiate in waves of courage from my entire being. How long will you search in the worlds of the dead for the living? How long will you wander in the shade instead of turning your eyes to the light? No matter how wondrous the implement, how perfect the plan, all science ends where the divine begins. Between you and the truth of life stands a wall that nothing of material things can pierce, where even the reasoning mind cannot go, and there even the greatest scientists must stop bowing to an infinite all which they cannot grasp, measure or define. In hours of sickness man cries not to science but to his God. In the great extremity the soul leaves its reason and cries to its universal Father for courage and for strength. Upon the mystic wall of the infinite science batters itself to pieces because it refuses to accept that which it cannot see. The greatest scientists in all the world are the ones who know that the visible is but a tiny grain floating in the endless oceans of the invisible. From the invisible it came, and to the invisible it shall return, and puny minds shall never grasp the path it goes nor understand the working of its mysterious power. Far from the eyes of man in the hidden hermitages of the unseen are those who know its passing and are so close to the footstool of the light that the secret things of nature to them are simple truths indeed. But if you would have the light you must seek where it is, realizing that neither science nor philosophy, art nor letters, nor anything of man, shall measure the boundless limits of the divine. It was my voice but the Master's words, and as the moments passed he unfolded to the group gathered before me the basic principles of the ancient wisdom. He told of the sacred school of the 12 prophets, of the ray of the black light, of the planet of death and the sacred lamasseries in India, of the brothers of the shining robe and their labors with mankind and the powers which they have over life and death, and then of the children of men chosen to know the mysteries of God. At last he stopped and my tongue grew silent too, for there seemed no more to say. And so, dazed and bewildered, I sat down with the master still beside me. A silence followed my words, then a sigh broke from the circle of listeners. One elderly man arose. "Your story, sir, is very remarkable. But what proof have you to offer of the things of which you tell? For years we have been schooled in human knowledge, to the proving and truing of things. Can you demonstrate to us anything superior to science or greater and superior to the physical world that surrounds us?" I was about to say no, but the master nodded his head and my lips uttered the word yes. At the same time, the invisible white-robed form of the master descended from the rostrum in front of me and, unseen by the group of scientists, stepped over to an elderly man sitting in a great leather chair. Suddenly the figure rose and raised his hand to his eyes, crying, "My God! There is a face in the air in front of me. Two terrible eyes." And with a cry he fell forward onto the floor. Immediately the room was in an uproar and scientists and philosophers gathered around the prostrate form of white-haired man who lay face downward upon the Persian carpet. The professor, who had been sitting next to me and who was one of Europe's greatest physicians, elbowed his way through the crowd and knelt beside the prostrate figure. He then arose sadly and, turning to the assembled group, announced, "Sir Richard is dead." A gasp went around the crowd. One of England's leading astronomers and physicists had passed into the great beyond. The master prompted me and I spoke. "Professor, you have stated that science is unapproachable in its power. What is science to do now? Answer me a question, for I have answered yours." "This is no time for idle argument," exclaimed the professor. "Yes, it is," I answered, now master of the situation. "If science is perfect and omnipotent, let it restore Sir Richard to life." "Fool," answered the professor, "no human power can do that." "All right then," I answered, "there is something that science cannot do." "Then explain to me, what is death? And why must all living things pass through it?" "The organisms just stop working," announced the scientist. "But what is the power behind the working?" I asked. "No one knows," answered the professor. "Yes, I do." Again the faces of all were turned to me and I reiterated some of the statements I had made during the evening. The higher consciousness and the superior bodies of man, including the spirit, the astral body and the mind, leave the physical form by passing out at the top of the skull with a twisting motion to then function on the subtler planes of nature. The consciousness has not died, but has merely discarded a useless vehicle to function in a newer and finer organism. "How can you prove that any intelligent thing has left?" demanded a voice. "How?" "Why, by bringing it back," I answered. I leaned over and placed my hand upon the forehead of the dead man. At the same time the master stooped over me and a thrill of force passed into the organism at my feet. I took the dead man by the hand, whereupon his eyes opened, and with my assistance he slowly rose to his feet and gazed around in a dazed sort of way. A gasp went around the circle of scientists. "Did you do this?" demanded one. "No," I answered, "I am but the mouthpiece. The great master I told you of, who dwells in the temple of the caves in the heights of the Himalayas, has been with me all this evening and, unseen by you, has performed the works to prove the truths that I have sought to give you. Slowly the group parted and the wise men of Europe gathered in small clusters to discuss the problem as I passed slowly out the door and back to my apartments. I afterwards heard from one of the members of the group who talked with the professor after I left. He asked him, "Well, sir, what do you think of it?" "Bunkum, my dear sir, bunkum pure and simple," announced the international scientist as he lighted a very black cigar and sent an attendant scurrying after a whiskey and soda. "A pure coincidence, my dear fellow, a pure coincidence, but of no scientific value whatsoever. As I said in my talk, the man is a dangerous lunatic and should be confined. There is positively nothing in the universe superior to science. I know, my dear fellow, for I have been a scientist for 50 years. You are certainly a marvel, Professor," answered the man as he walked away. The professor stepped over to the rostrum and picked up the crumpled piece of paper containing the questions he had written and which I had dropped after answering them. He stared for a second or two and then put on his glasses, for all the questions were answered in fine writing around the margin of the sheet. "Most extraordinary," exclaimed the scientist. "When did he write that on there?" I watched him every minute. As he spoke, the piece of paper turned to dust and disintegrated between his fingers. The professor adjusted his extra eyeglass and gazed at his empty fingers. "Most extraordinary. That fellow is surely clever. But he will never be able to convince me that science is not the last word. Another whiskey and soda, boy, my nerves have been completely unstrung. Lord Buddha." He came in a packing box bound round with bands of steel and iron, dented and battered by its rough usage during a trip of many months. The packing box stood unopened for many weeks before the sacrilegious hands of uninterested servants broke it open and scattered heaps of excelsior and wrapping paper about the floor. At last the figure stood revealed, undoubtedly one of the strangest that had ever crossed the waters from the land of the Blue Lotus. Lord Buddha was a wondrous life-sized wood carving, and even the servants seemed awed as they gazed upon his gilded form. Many strange stories had come with him from East Island East. It was told that the master himself had breathed the breath of life into the ancient carving, making it sacred to all the children of light. Be that as it may, the Lord Buddha was surely a thing of glory. His robes, carved with wondrous fineness out of ancient teak, were richly covered with solid gold leaf and many-colored lacquers, while his eyes were precious stones set deep into the dark wood which formed the face. Upon his forehead was a mighty diamond, one of the greatest that has ever come out of India. Even the unromantic were forced to stop for a moment and gaze in admiration at the wondrous figure of India's immortal reformer. They took Lord Buddha from the packing case and stood him upon an ebony tabouret in the Gothic library of the Chadwick home, and there he remained shaded by the gloom of ancient rafters during the weeks and months that passed. Unhonored and unrevered, a breath of the mystic East amid the mold of the prostic West. Lord Chadwick had always had a taste for antiques, and his Indian appointment had given him great opportunities to indulge it. But the main reason why he secured Lord Buddha was because the Hindus did not want him to have it. When you know Lord Chadwick, you know that that was reason enough. We will not go into details as to how he acquired the statue, for he followed a rather, shall we say, irregular manner, not unusual among foreigners in the Orient. The Christian seldom asks the heathen for anything he wants, but just takes it. If the native protests, the Christian shoots him. So with great expense and labor Lord Buddha was sent to London, where he remained in silent meditation, surrounded by cobwebs and the curse of an outraged priestcraft. A brief description of Lord Chadwick may not be out of place at this moment. He was one of those particularly affable gentlemen who was always a leading attraction among the ladies and a source of great inspiration to all who do not know him too well. While admitting his affability and his military foolish, it is necessary, for the proper unfolding of our story, that we unveil certain parts of his private life which are of a slightly different flavor. Poor Lady Chadwick had been dragged through a knothole and then stepped on in the course of being duly impressed by her husband's personal omnipotence, and a strange pathetic expression appeared in her bleared eyes every time anyone congratulated her upon her choice of a husband. Not that the Earl was a tyrant or anything of that kind, just that a certain besetting sin went with the heraldry of his house. When the Earl was sober he was a gentleman, but after a few hours at the club he became infinitely inferior to a self-respecting animal. Every time his lordship fell victim to his indiscretion, a reign of terror descended upon the household, and suffering and misery formed the family lot. Not always just when Lord Chadwick was exercising his hereditary sins. It is a strange thing how temperaments become reversed under the influence of alcoholic stimulant, for Lord Chadwick sober and Lord Chadwick intoxicated were two entirely different beings, like the old story of Jekyll and Hyde. This is not a story, however, of family skeletons, but is a narrative wound around Lord Buddha, who stood, through all these passing months, on his lotus throne in the silent shades of the library, his hands clasped in meditation and his flowing robe gleaming in the half-light. A certain cold December evening had given way to the bleakness of a moonless night. Lady Chadwick stood before the fire in the library, her eyes fixed on the great clock hanging on the wall, whose silent fingers were passing slowly round the ancient dial. A great fear oppressed her, for Lord Chadwick and several of his cronies at the club had taken steps earlier in the evening which usually preceded one of my lord's streaks of intemperance. This part of our story deals with the ancient fable of the worm who turned. Lady Chadwick, inspired by the flaring embers of a dying will, had decided that from now on her husband would have to find within the heraldry of his house some symptom of inherited courtesy and restraint. Reared in obedience, married off in perfect obedience, beaten to further increase said obedience, Milady was about to commit Europe's most terrible sin, an expression of individuality. An impermissible thing among the blue blood of the old country. It was about 3:30 when a cab pulled up at the door and two voices broke the stillness, whose tones were about as thick as the average London night. "5 bob," called a voice. "You heard me, 5 bob, not a farthing less." "Stuo mush," sounded a muffled growl. "I won't pay it." 5 bob. "You blighty, 5 bob." Then there came the sound of a blow. The voice of the hackman broke forth, this time as pure Cockney, his language consisting of one malediction after another. "Help, help, he's strangling me." "Shut up," threatened a thick voice, "take thash and thash." At the same time there was the sound of 2 heavy thuds, followed by a low groan. Then unsteady steps on the pavement and a grating noise as my lord tried to fit his key into the door hinge. "SH won't fit, SH won't fit," he muttered. "SH must be wrong key." "Well, I'll fix shit." The next instant there was a crash as Lord Chadwick kicked his foot through the plate glass door piece and unlatched the portal from the inside. There was the sound of steps advancing at a right oblique, and as Lady Chadwick faced the library door, the form of her better half appeared in all the dignity of inebriate nobility. Lord Chadwick was a tall, broad-shouldered man, heavily tanned by exposure to the eastern suns, and with the muscles of an ox. He now stood swaying slightly on patent leather hinges, his tall silk hat over one eye and his evening cape dangling along the ground on the end of his cane. Putting a white-gloved hand over his mouth, he hiccuped gently behind it. "Well, whash you looking at?" Without a word, Lady Chadwick turned and with tears in her eyes faced the great open fireplace on the opposite side of the room. "Wash matter?" demanded the nobleman as he reached out and hung his hat on an imaginary hook about 6 feet in the air. "Why don't you speak to me?" "John Chadwick, you are drunk again," exclaimed his wife, turning around. "You don't hash to tell me. I know it." "Hash such wonderful time," and my lord swallowed hard. "But what has that got to do with it? Why don't you come over and say good morning?" His wife remained silent and turned again with her back to her husband. "Well, why don't you answer? Don't you know I'm your husband?" Still no sound from Lady Chadwick. A strange expression slowly came into the eyes of Lord Chadwick. He straightened up and his face grew hard. "Come here," he demanded. Still his wife never moved. "I told you to come here. When I want anyone in this house, they have got to come. If you don't come right over, I'll throw this at your head." And he picked up a large china vase. Lady Chadwick remained as before, and without further warning her husband threw the china jar with all his might across the room. But he staggered as it left his hand, and it missed her by several feet. "You brute!" exclaimed his wife as the vase crashed into a great Venetian plate glass, sending fragments in all directions. Then the thing which all his family feared happened. The spirit of ages of degeneracy and debauchery possessed him. Lord Chadwick's body slowly bent forward, and his head sank on his chest between his great arms, which swung like those of a monster ape. His lips drew hack from his teeth, and the white of his eyes grew red and streaked. The parlor gentleman had become the domestic beast. With a scream, his wife shrank back as the figure slowly advanced his steps, no longer unsteady hut, now like the stealthy tread of an animal. Reaching a great chair, the Earl picked it up with the ease of a giant and hurled it across the room, where it struck the old stone wall and was splintered to bits by the force of the blow. His wife, terrified beyond expression, crept slowly back into the corner of the room, while ever closer loomed the form of her husband, now blinded with drunken rage. At last the corner was reached, and further retreat was impossible. She had stopped beside the figure of Lord Buddha, who stood in silent contemplation, unmoved by the scene of confusion around him. As she shrank back, her shoulder touched his lacquered robe, and the chill caused her to draw aside. Suddenly, crouching like an animal, Lord Chadwick sprang at the trembling figure of his wife, and with a cry of terror she jumped behind the statue of Lord Buddha. With an implication, Chadwick rushed against the statue, throwing his arms around it to cast it aside. But though he pulled and tugged, the figure of the Oriental demigod would not move underscore. It seemed rooted to the ground. As he tried to pass around it, It seemed that the robes spread out on each side, and before the Earl realized it, he found himself twisted and wound in what seemed folds of golden lacquer. Struggling, twisting, and roaring like an angry hull, he sought to escape from the statue. His wife watched in amazement, for she saw her husband's hands and arms apparently growing to the form which he tugged and tore to escape from. Slowly the minutes passed. Lord Chadwick's struggles became less and less until finally, exhausted and enveloped in folds of yellow lacquer, he fell at the feet of the statue, his hands and arms still glued to its surface. The Earl was now thoroughly sober. The terror of his position, held prisoner by a force unknown, took all the hate out of his being. "How am I going to get free?" he kept muttering, and turned with pleading eyes to his wife. She, realizing that the fit of passion was gone, attempted to release him. But his hands seemed part of the statue, and as she watched, Lady Chadwick gave a scream of amazement and terror. The fingers and hands of the Earl were slowly becoming encrusted with a golden film. At the point where he grasped the statue, they had become like the teakwood beneath them. In other words, he was turning into an idol himself under the mysterious power of the sacred form of Lord Buddha. As his wife stood there in perplexity, she heard footsteps behind her, and turning, she looked into the faces of three men, all of them Orientals. They must have entered through the broken doorway. "Who are you?" she demanded, starting back. One of them bowed politely and spoke in perfect English. "Our names will do you very little good, madam, but we have come all the way from the sacred shrine in India to take Lord Buddha back to his home." Lady Chadwick immediately replied, "Yes, yes, take the statue gladly. But how can I release my husband, for his hands and arms are turning into lacquer?" The priest shook his head. "That is the curse of Lord Buddha upon those who defile his sanctity." "Is there nothing that can be done that Jay may escape?" pleaded Lord Chadwick. "There is no way but through prayers to Lord Buddha, for he is the Lord of righteousness, and if it pleases him, he may release you from his golden self. If not, you must await the end. I will give anything that I have to be released. My arms are growing cold, and a creeping death is upon me," cried the nobleman. Suddenly a strange thing happened. The mouth of the Buddha opened, and a voice seemed to breath out from the soul of the statue. "I am Lord Buddha. Ages ago I breathed myself into this thing of wood carved by the hands of the faithful. You stole me from my shrine, but that sin was not your greatest. Know you that those who seek protection behind the yellow robe of the Buddha shall not seek in vain. No man shall pass this gleaming robe for works of hate. I am going back again to my people who love me, honor me, and revere me. But before I go, I grant your life on one condition, that never again shall you abuse it. And if you do, as surely as I stand here today, you shall become a figure of wood and stone." Slowly the hands of Lord Chadwick fell from the statue, and the folds of lacquer seemed to swing and sway in the breeze that came through the open door. The statue then stepped down from its pedestal and, as the three Orientals fell on their knees before it, passed slowly out of the door, draped in its blowing robes of gold. On the ground as it passed were left strange footmarks pressed into the very surface of the floor. Without a word, the three Orientals followed the carven figure, and Lord Chadwick suddenly swayed with dizziness and fell across the pedestal to the floor. My lord suddenly sat up in his chair and gazed around him. The London Times fell from between his fingers and he slowly drew in one foot, whose close proximity to the fireplace was undoubtedly the cause of his sudden awakening. He turned to his wife, who was sitting reading a few feet away. "How long have I been asleep?" "About an hour and a half, dear," she answered meekly. "By Jove! The most peculiar dream. You know, you have often asked me to stop drinking. I have half a mind to do it. By the way, I dreamed that my statue of Buddha came to life and walked off. Wasn't that unusual? I must go over and look at him again. He is the most." Lord Chadwick had stopped and was staring at the recess in the wall where Lord Buddha had stood. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. "Good Lord! It's gone!" "Really?" exclaimed Lady Chadwick mildly. "Are you sure you haven't mislaid it, my dear?" "Do you know," announced his lordship, "I believe I will stop drinking." Suddenly his face brightened up. "I see it all now," he muttered. "They told me that they would get it back. They are a strange people, those Orientals." "If you think they are strange, they must be strange, my dear," remarked his well-regulated wife eagerly. Milord sat down again with his feet on the grating. "I haven't lived in India for 20 years without seeing something of Oriental magic. That dream of mine was more than a dream, it was Oriental magic. They have spirited the statue away. I wish the spirits would wipe their shoes when they come in," murmured Lady Chadwick. "Look at those footprints all the way to the door." The Earl gazed at them. His mind turned to the shrines of India, and a strange expression came into his face. "What are those things?" asked his wife. "Will you please tell me, dear?" "They are the footprints of Lord Buddha," answered the nobleman. "What are they, John? You know I always let you do my heavy thinking for me." "I don't understand it myself very well," answered Milord as he stroked his chin reflectively. "But there goes the dinner bell, and I must be at the club this evening, so you had better come, my dear." "Yes, John." Copyright 2025 by Manly Hall Official. Thank you for listening. Please consider to subscribe, like, and share to help the channel growth. New videos on a daily basis.